I would like to say that I'm incredibly fortunate to have been here today to listen to so many interesting people talking about amazing projects. As you may have understood from my introduction, I am not, let's say, a practitioner in this area. The last many years I've been working mostly in the art world and quite far from most of these concerns. Let's say I have a personal interest in all of these issues, but only, let's say, planning for protest is perhaps the first, say, attempt at combining a personal interest with say, professional practice. The exhibition and publication was prepared for the Lisbon Architecture Triennale last September. And in this spirit, it's somehow not a scientific, you know, from the title you could say planning for protest as an exercise, as a, say, design exercise. It wasn't so much that, and it was also not a properly scientific analysis. It was more like a sort of a provocative or maybe innocent question directed at a group of architects. I organized this together with a bunch of other people, Ben Allen, an architect from the UK, James, an editor from Los Angeles, myself, Shannon and Adam from New York, Shannon an urban designer, so perhaps the person with a sort of deeper engagement in these subjects, and Adam, graphic designer. We invited 12 teams from 12 cities, and we asked them a relatively ambiguous question. We asked them, how does architecture and the urban fabric, how does it affect protest? How does it condition protest? Is protest, all the sort of eruptions that we've seen in the last few years in several cities across the globe, is it by any chance influenced by architecture? Or can architecture sort of, or can an architect, let's put it like this, can an architect observe this phenomena and act upon it in whatever possible way? I will talk about a few of these proposals, not all, 8 of them. And I'll start with Athens. They are presented alphabetically, but also, in a way, Athens is, it's interesting to talk about Athens first for a number of reasons. One, also because it's been, at least in Europe, somehow the beginning of this last cycle of restlessness. And Athens somehow today represents a bit of hopelessness. It's, I mean, Greece is on the verge of becoming a failed state, and what's happened in the streets of Athens has perhaps sparked sympathy in the beginning, eventually a certain sort of apathy, and eventually no one really knows what's going on there anymore. Interestingly, Aristide Antonas reacted to our quest a little bit in acceptance of this. He thinks that the Constitution basically has failed, and that protest is no longer efficient or necessary. He considers the city of Athens to be as a trap for protest. And he makes an interesting analysis. He says that the main similarity between protests in Athens and elsewhere around the world is the action of the police rather than the action of the protesters. So somehow protest has also become somewhat a commodity. So he believes the Greek constitution has failed and that there is no new civic norms that need to be adopted. And his response is, in a way, perhaps it relates a little bit to some of the projects we've seen, and he's come up with the term of Athens protocol. So he proposes to install across the city of Athens a number of what he calls protocols. Are basically they are spaces, but they're also rules. So they're spaces where people can meet and discuss basically the basis of a new constitution. What you see, of course, is this particular image is in front of the Greek Parliament. This is another. Anton has proposed a number of structures, so I'm not going to show all of them, but this one in particular is a space not dissimilar to some of those we've seen earlier that is meant to be just a shelter and for people to gather and discuss a new future. Again, the same here. Then we'll talk about Berlin. Berlin, you would probably ask why Berlin, and of course, well, I'm from Berlin, so I had a certain interest. But of course, Berlin is perceived, particularly, I'm Portuguese, so in Portugal, and I guess in many other countries in Europe, particularly in Southern Europe, Berlin is perceived as this sort of global capital. Yeah? So the media refers to Berlin as Berlin has decided this, Berlin has decided that. And because I'm also from Berlin, it's quite an awkward way of reading the city if you're outside of Germany. That people think that Berlin somehow symbolically represents this power, and of course in many countries some sort of evil. Berlin is none of that really, the city itself, unless I guess you work for the government. So it was interesting to look at it, also because of the history of Berlin and how protest and resistance has been so reoccurrent. Studio Miesen, or Marcus Miesen, analysis was interestingly similar to the experience I have, and he somehow believes that there's a certain banality of protest in Berlin, and that Berlin has become a city which is indifferent. I can testify for that because, you know, when you're talking to people, say I'm in Berlin being a Portuguese discussing what's happening in Portugal, with my Portuguese friends, they would ask me about Berlin, this Berlin of power. My Berlin friends, they do not understand that perception because they don't, somehow Berlin is not part of this mindset. But one thing that Miesen says that he believes has happened in Berlin the last few years is that that protest has become banal, and that there's an indifference to it. And his response to our brief was an attempt at, basically what he did was he recreated posters for fictitious demonstrations that perhaps should have happened in Berlin, some of which did happen, but without much result. And of course, this would be more for people who know these people, but this is Klaus Wowereit, mayor of Berlin. And the next one is Frank Steller, who's the architect of the Staatsschloss, the big sort of palace being rebuilt in the center of Berlin. And he's associated them with sentences that you would not necessarily associate with these figures. And basically it's a provocation to this. So Berlin has gone through some worrisome urban development lately, and there hasn't been much of I mean, obviously there has been protest, but let's say that it's not kept some of these steps from taking place. The third city, Bucharest, I don't know, Alex is here, he from Studio Bazaar, who prepared this response. Why Bucharest? Again, an interesting reason. I mean, of course, we are on sort of towards Eastern Europe, so I suppose perhaps here there's more attention to what's happening in Bucharest, but somehow the events in Spain and Portugal and Italy and so on, at least in Western Europe, I have the impression that somehow we just stopped hearing about what was happening in Romania or in Bulgaria or in a number of other countries that have had quite similar problems. Studio Bazar's response was, again, a little bit different. They've done a methodical study of a particular space in Bucharest, the University Square, which has a symbolic value because, of course, it's where the revolution happened in '89. And I'll show you 3 pictures. The first one is basically a mapping of where these important protests happened. The larger picture, I believe it's all of these people put together. The second sheet is a more sort of functional analysis of the square. I mean, the square is obviously not a square, as in it's a group of spaces which are crisscrossed by a number of roads, and basically this can be seen in the pictures above, that there are various forms of occupying this space. And what Studio Bazar did was a simple proposal that somewhat uses the same tools as, I mean, one could say that the reason why the square is divided by roads and all these spaces are separated has to do with a certain form of political control, trying to avoid people from actually gathering. You cannot actually at present cross any these big avenues. You have to go through an underpass, which of course makes it difficult for people to gather and so on. And what they proposed was to build a large pedestrian crossing that would symbolically, but also in practical terms, unify this space and transform it into a more whole, so that people can actually gather in larger numbers or in the way they wish to. Somehow the idea of crossing in this project is almost as if it's a monument to conquest of this particular public space. The fourth one is Cairo. Cairo is, of course, quite specific in this array because it's the only city where that has just recently came out of a dictatorship, and perhaps it's in another one, I'm not exactly sure. But at the time when Cluster was preparing this proposal, it was a sort of an intermediate moment, and they had an initial response to our question that had to do with dividing basically what they considered to be 2 quite different types of protests. The first, the loud one, the one that everyone saw on television and the one that sparked the revolution. And the second one, which is for them perhaps more interesting, the silent, what they call the slow encroachment. And this has to do with how citizens attempted to change this top-down paradigm that we keep talking about, and how in the process of the revolution became urban citizens. So the claim to public space actually happened in a much more sort of basic manner. And so they made an analysis of a few different, I think I have 2 here to show, but this one is obviously how the ecosystem of vendors and kiosks across the city changed dramatically in just a few weeks since the revolution started, and how people started occupying space in a much more sort of creative manner without the fear of the police. And so this kind of, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but basically at the end of the dictatorship, actually just a year before, 2, I suppose because there was a lot of tension, a number of important avenues and public spaces in Cairo started being divided with railing. So you basically couldn't cross anywhere, with the exception of very small, narrow spaces. So, of course, at the time of the revolution, people started acting on a quite individual manner. And so in the case of the vendors, what you see, and then, of course, one other case that was quite advertised at the time as an interesting example of what was happening had to do with this ring road. So basically the ring road was also an exercise of power, and it only opened, so there were only entries and exits to very specific neighborhoods. So neighborhoods that were more problematic were actually isolated and cut off from this ring road. And so in a few days after the revolution, people started building access ramps and stairs, and they started using this ring road in a complete different manner. Of course, it's a different way of claiming public space through everyday acts of resistance. The fifth one is Dublin. It was made by Cultuurstruction, which is a small office with 2 young architects. Dublin, again, a different type of city, the second country in the European Union to go into this crisis, but one of which we didn't hear that much about. Dublin was always the good student. Little turmoil, not that much protest. What Cultuurstruction did was they analyzed at first the history of protest in Dublin, which is, of course, traditionally through marches. And these marches go, obviously, through the historical symbols of the city. The idea that Cultuurstruction had was that a new route of protest would be necessary, one which would reveal somehow the spatial representation of the state versus capital entanglement. So obviously, all of the institutions that were responsible for the crisis, for the financial crisis in Ireland, are not on this route, and they're actually also part of it's an interesting fact, but basically the IFCC, so all these sort of large banks and so on, are in a part of Dublin which where actually most public space has been privatized, so all these streets have been developed by the banks and so on and so forth. This picture you see here is one of the banks that collapsed, and which in the meantime has been bought by the Irish Central Bank, and it's going to become the new headquarters of this newborn Ireland. And what they did was to propose this new headquarters of the bank to actually, what you see in the drawings underneath is the idea they have of, so just to explain, the building was unfinished because the bank collapsed. And what they thought of doing was actually to recover, when you see the third figure, is basically they've proposed to leave the first 3 floors of the building as a public space, which is actually emulating the design of the current Irish Central Bank in the center of the city from the 60s, a project from the 60s. And what they propose is to create a new forum for transparency. So the idea that this new central bank should basically allow people to come in and verify what's taking place. And finally, proposing a new route through the city that makes visible what has happened in the last crisis. The next project is in Madrid. Of course, Madrid, we had to ask someone in Madrid because there's so many interesting practices coming from there. The response from Ecosistema Urbano was also interesting in the sense that they actually they reached out to a number of the other practices, I believe 20 in total or so of people who contributed, and the key aspect of their response was the study. So basically they studied all the documentation that resulted from this, the 15M, and this analysis gave them this idea that there is a clear that you can basically divide what has taken place in physical and digital space. And they were interested to see how this physical and digital space were combined and were sort of mutually affected. In their case, their proposal is mostly an analysis, but it's one that pushes, which basically demonstrates a number of interesting new tools to discover and somehow manage public space. They were of the impression that the majority of the people that were in the streets at this time basically learned a new city and learned how to interact with the city in a different manner, often through the help of these same digital tools. they also believed that this aspect of self-organization was key to how persistent and resistant these movements were, and how, and they believe that this is perhaps one of the strongest gains, the fact that people learned how to organize themselves and to work collaboratively and to work towards a better future. One of the last projects, Rome. Rome is interesting because it's also a complex urban laboratory that has gone through so many different stages of religious and political power, and where, like in many other cities, protest, of course, takes place mostly in historical areas. Piovani Fabian 2A plus PA response was to actually bring back a tool of understanding public space. These are obviously they're tiles from a new Nolly map that they designed. They're of the impression that the majority of Roman citizens don't have a consciousness of the public interior space. And what they proposed was to go through the city and basically reenact the Nolly, well, just update the Nolly plan that basically shows all the spaces that belong to the city, like you all know. And somehow to promote this new Nolly plan as an updated tool to understand the complexities of public and private space. The last one is Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo, what started happening, all the large protests in Brazil started happening actually as we're going towards the end of the project, but we thought it was interesting to include, well, for a number of reasons. One which has to do with the fact that these protests were mostly sparked by actual urban problems. I mean, this is true also for Istanbul. In the case of Brazil, obviously a problem of public transport that ignited the first demonstrations, which then, of course, escalated into a lot more complex demands, and it's still an ongoing issue, of course. And Vapor 324, what they focused, they made a bit of a sort of a mix between a number of the other approaches. They did obviously an analysis of the metropolis and mostly focused on the access to information. So obviously, Sao Paulo is quite segregated. There are areas that they have very varying, basically participation in society and access to media. And what they proposed was a number of structures through the city to convey information. So in a way, it's a simple sort of idea of aiding, sort of assisting citizens to access independent information, and the design of which is what you can see. So basically, cranes with LED screens that can broadcast messages in the city. I would like to end. I mean, of course, I would like to discuss and answer questions, but I would like to end just by reading a couple of quotes from two essays that we published along with the book. The proposals responding to the brief of planning for protest belong to the effort of rediscovering this politicity of architecture. However, participating in this geography of protest implies questioning the very forms from which to access visibility and political participation. Not only are the institutional forms exhausted, but also the forms of protest and resistance. And this is precisely the radical challenge that contemporary democracy demands from us. In this sense, it's not enough to rely on a certain activism of social or social responsibility of the profession. It takes an understanding of how architecture can contribute to the design new forms of access to politics and new spaces for the common, to design new walls, even if this means destroying others, capable of defining other forms of partaking and redistributing spaces and places, for fomenting access for communities and peoples to their political destiny, that is, the government of themselves. And the second and last, to occupy urban space, public or private, became one of the most radical acts of political rebellion, as there's nothing more political than the occupation of this scarce resource. After the loss of these squares, it will be the virtual space, controlled by companies and regulated by the political power, that will be in dispute. The geography of protest is the best barometer of our democracy. Who conquers our squares, not just for a day, but permanently, can finally say that they've achieved freedom. Thank you.